This is a presentation. It's supposed to be live. It's a coming forth in regard to Restore Executive Life Leadership Coaching and Consulting. Working with whether or not it is live. Not sure that it is live. It'd be funny if it is live. I'd like to know if you're listening to this. I'm watching the numbers go by. I'm on my iPad in regard to what's taking place in this. Looks like it is that it is recording. So I'm new to this on the iPad. I'll get off of it in a few moments and record and make sure that it takes place in regard to what we're doing. At any rate, there are a number of things that are taking place today, 25th of July, 2025. And on yesterday, I put out a test for our new app. I sent it out to a few individuals, and I'm trying to understand, seeking to read and find out how to put it out on Facebook, and to possibly have it at a website as well, either real-coach.com or iwillrestore.org, and have it available for you. The intent is to get feedback, excuse me, on how it could be better. So that's my intent. My social media person indicates that I must, or I should, actually do live presentations. And I'm working on that, visual live presentations as opposed to talking and not being seen. It is talking and being seen. In the last few days, I have had conversations and been able to see various individuals, and perhaps that is why I am doing this particular presentation. One of the persons that I spoke with was a dear lady that we met a few years ago, and this is a story I want to say about that. That dear lady, when we went to see her, she was an associate, let me put it that way, of a lady whose name was Miss Cuffey. Miss Cuffey was working at an agency that was called a Prisoners Aid Association. I believe it is still in existence in Baltimore, Maryland. And Miss Cuffey had an aide. I would just simply say that her name was Lachelle. Lachelle was the aide to Miss Cuffey. We went there. When I say we, I mean my wife, whose name is Violka, and I. We went there to see if we could work with that particular company. We were working as I Will Restore Ministries at the time, and we were offering the services that dealt with individuals who had been physically, sexually abused as a result of childhood trauma. And when we went there, we sat down and had a conversation with Miss Curry. Now, the thing about Miss Curry, I believe her first name was Gail, but I'm not sure about that. That may have been her sister, whom we learned about later. But Miss Cuffey was actually a descendant, a direct descendant of, I believe the man was named Paul Cuffey, C-A-F-F-E. I believe. Paul Cuffey is a historical figure in America. You can look him up. We did not know that when we first saw her, nor for a few years later, I think. But we were gotten in contact with her relatives, or they got in contact with us. At any rate, we had a conversation with Miss Cuffey over the next few visits and everything like that. But that first day was monumental, and we would learn that later as we went on and had continuous meetings with Miss Cuffey. But the first day was monumental. What occurred, according to Michelle, that Miss Cuffey ended up that day bringing Michelle into her office and also had conversations with her fellow workers in regard, and also her family as well, in regard to herself and what her past had been. She revealed to all of them that her past was not as they particularly thought it was. And she told them of what had happened in the past, various kinds of pain, trauma, abuse that had occurred in her past, and how she had tried to mitigate it, live with it, deal with it. But that as a result of that, trying to deal with it, live with it, mitigate it, she had basically stuffed it down and told no one, and it had continued to fester and pain and really destroy her creativity and everything else in her life. And she had lived a kind of sheltered life, or life that just caused her to be less than her whole self. But as a result of our conversation, showing her that she was really on the very deepest level of her being, she was whole, perfect, and complete, and that she was beloved of God and not forsaken by God, that God had always loved her and had never forsaken her, and that she was really God's beloved child. And we had such conversations. Those conversations were based on the Bible, and it was also based on the myths, as we call them, that are found in the sacred writings of people from all over the world. And we continued to assure her that she was someone that God was always with, because God had hidden God's self within. And so we talked about that. And we talked about what was in my book called I Will Restore. And it was the idea of the scandal that took place. And that, again, is found within the Bible, as I talk about in my book called I Will Restore. And the scandal is that the scandalizo is found within the Bible. And it talks about this, where it talks about the scandalizo was called the trap stick, which is when a person is trapped by the pulling out of a stick. When you have a box that has a stick, and the stick holds the cord and is held, has a cord, and when you pull it down, the stick comes down, and the animal is trapped inside of the box. That's a scandalizo, and that's the scandal of the Bible, the scandal of the gospel. Is that the scandal is that when somebody's trapped inside, they can either be trapped inside or they can be trapped out. And either way, they're trapped. They have lost their options. And individuals in Jesus Christ's time were trapped. They were either trapped out or they were trapped in. And they were forced to live with one or the other. They did not have access to the wider world. And Jesus Christ came, as the text says, to set the captive free. And what happened with Miss Cuffey was that she was set free. She knew that she had options. She knew that no matter what had happened to her in life, it did not determine whether she could be in the box or outside of the box. She was free to make her own decisions, and that's the vital part of it all. She could make her own decisions. If she wanted to be inside, that was her decision. She could hold on to that identity and say that's who she was. Or she could be outside, and that was her identity, but it was her choice. As for shame, she did not have any reason to be ashamed. If she made a conscious decision that event, whatever it was, had happened to her, then that was her decision. That was her choice. If it was not her decision, she could look at it, understand that it was still all going to work together for her good, and that God, who oversees all things, had allowed it to happen, and that Spirit was still going to make it work together for her good. And she could trust, as the Bible says, in God with all of her heart and lean not to her own understanding, and know that God was directing her paths. And you can find text after text after text, whether it's in the sacred scriptures of Christianity, or in the sacred scriptures of the Jewish nation, or in the sacred scriptures of whatever the nationality and ethnic group it might be. You can find that same thing found over and over and over and over again. The story of Job and other individuals like that, that's what those stories are all about. Why do things like that happen? Because sometimes what was meant for evil by some of the individuals, or what is called the devil, whatever it might be, there's a whole different level of understanding when it comes to you move to a higher level and you see that what was meant for evil eventually turns out for good. You can look at the story of Joseph and others. Those things are stories for that reason. And so all of those things we were able to share with Miss Cuffey. And this is how this worked out even more so. As I talked the other day with Miss Lachelle, as she invited me to come because we had worked for a period of time in the city of Baltimore. We had worked there with children in schools and other places, walking the streets there and everything, and it seemed that we had angels that were following us as we were there in Baltimore City, and it was just a great time working there. And so Lachelle a few days ago was encouraging us, inviting us really to come and work with her. She has her own agency now, and she does a mighty work there. And we're so thankful to have had the opportunity to talk with her this time and in the past. And there are some mighty things that happen in regard to her as well. We call her one of our spiritual daughters. And so this entire process that I'm talking about that happened with Miss Cuffey, because what happened with Miss Cuffey really was that as she shared her particular experience with others, we did not know. And what was taking place is that in a few days, Miss Cuffey would die. Let me say that again. We came, my wife Bjork and I, we came to Prisoners Aid. Really, we were directed to Prisoners Aid because Spirit knew that in a few days, Miss Cuffey would die. And we were there to give her the assurance that she was all right with God, that inner peace that she needed. And just a few years before, she had actually met, if you will, Lachelle. And she had been training her. But when we came, Lachelle's training intensified. And Miss Cuffey trained her even the more. And Lachelle became someone who eventually, when Miss Cuffey, just like and I said this to Lachelle, became like someone in the movie Black Panther when the father said the son had to be ready for his assignment before the father could pass away. Lachelle had to be ready for her assignment before Miss Cuffey could pass away. And so for those final few days, Miss Cuffey took it upon herself to more fully train Miss Lachelle than she had been trained before. And the work that Miss Lachelle does now, it is monumental. It is changing lives. She is working with people in various parts of Baltimore. The example that she is setting for people all over, not just Baltimore, but all over the United States of America, all over the world. She is leaving a testimonial to herself and to Miss Cuffey as well. She is just a beautiful person, a very smart individual, and she is just royal in the way that she goes about life. And I talk with her. She talks really fast. That I think it's New York in her and everything. But she is just a professional in what she does. If you ever get the opportunity to meet her, to talk with her, to work with her, then you got to come with your A+++ game. And she does not bite her tongue when it comes to telling you or telling me what needs to be said. She invited me again, as was said, to come and work with her because we did some things with her. We also told her her value. And it's not just an outer beauty that she has. She is beautiful, no question about it. She is also beautiful inside. A loving individual, a kind individual. She told me about setting up a place for individuals to both be housed and to be fed when it was cold outside in the middle of the winter on Christmas Eve, I think it was. That's Lachelle. In the city of Baltimore, that's Lachelle. Setting up food lines, and then I've been over there where she was giving out school supplies. That's Lachelle. She is a consummate professional. Miss Cuffey loved her. We love her. She calls us her spiritual parents and all kinds of things. We've seen her when she's on top of the world, and we've seen her when it seems that the world was on top of her. She is a wonderful, wonderful person. Baltimore is blessed to have her. You hear me? Mayor Scott, yes, you're blessed to have her. And so we're very, very thankful. And so that's what's happened in the past few days we've worked. She's been one of those clients that we work with, as far as whether you call it I Will Restore or whether you call it Restore Executive Life and Leadership Coaching and Consulting. We really have not broadcast all the work that we've done in any kind of way, because when we were doing it, we called it the non-profit. We actually looked at it, and believe me, Lachelle, of course, lays me out in regard to charging people. When she spoke with me the other day, she said again, did you charge somebody for this? Did you charge somebody for that? All of those kinds of things. And I don't necessarily go through the process of charging people all the time for the work that we do. Why? Well, you know, my first calling was to be a minister. My middle calling now is to be a minister. My last calling is to be a minister. That's it. So I wanted to do this. I'm not even sure how this goes in regard to being something and doing something live in regard to this. When I first did the aspect of becoming a for-profit business, the entire idea was given to us as a for-profit business. We initially were a nonprofit, and we still have the nonprofits as well. Very thankful for them. And we want to benefit people around the world. Around the world. We've got friends around the world, people who work with us who are in Nigeria, people who work with us and work for us, in regard to getting some things together who are in places like Pakistan the other day, whether it was real or not, or whether it was just propaganda spread about the young man who was on a ship that was made for 150, and it had 750 and supposedly capsized in the Mediterranean Sea or the Mediterranean Ocean, whichever that is. How it's named doesn't matter. But what it does mean is that it said that it capsized, and they had found less than 150 or less than 200 people who were on that ship. It bothered me about the story of the young man who was supposedly had a family, and his father had sold his, I think, house that was worth like $10,000 maybe or something like that, in order for this little 15-year-old boy who was on TikTok. And he was seeking to go and leave his family, and one of the children of his father, his brother, was a disabled child. And he was trying to do better for his family, like people in America at one point would go west. And he was trying to just go and make more money, I guess. And his way of doing that was to come to Europe, I guess, or go to Europe. But the boat capsized, and at the time I read it, he had not been found. That's painful. That's painful. And so I pray. I treat, as we call it. And I've had answers to prayer. I said to Lachelle the other day that I've had a similar situation where someone was dying in the hospital and came into the hospital room, and I wanted to make sure the person knew Jesus the Christ. And I asked her all kinds of questions, and Spirit said, sit down. And I sat down and went to sleep. When I woke up, I left, got to having prayer with the lady. And then the lady got out of jail. When she got out, she lived an additional 90 days. And as she lived that 90 days, she told them, her family, about an angel who had come to see her and what that angel had said. And then she also told them about a life she had, similar to Miss Cuffey. And the life that she had land, she had money, she had all things, and her children had never known of any of this. She also told them that when she passed, she wanted me, Pastor Dennis L. Waters, to do her funeral. At the time that happened, after she had done that, she went back to the hospital. And her daughter, who had been the one who contacted me, because the lady was not a member of the church that I served as pastor, and her daughter called me again. The time I got to the hospital, by the time I got in her room, she had been dead 4 minutes. I did do her funeral. At the end of her funeral, I went back to my home and I got in the room. And I basically stayed in the house for, 2 weeks. I did not come out. I was trying to work out what was happening. I wasn't depressed. I was just in some kind of maze, some kind of place. And what took place was that my church was having communion one night, and they sent an older man, an elder, to come and get me. His name was Elder Smith. And Elder Smith began to talk to me and asked me, well, what's wrong with you, Pastor? And I told him the experience that I was having. And he says, Pastor, I know what's wrong with you. He said, let me explain to you. He says, you were the presence of God for this dear woman. She felt that she was forsaken by God. You were the incarnation of the Christ to her. You were the incarnation. She felt that she was forgotten and unforgiven. And you assured her that she was not forgotten. She was forgiven for whatever she considered to have been wrong that she had done. And once he told me, explained inside myself, inside the spirit that was in Dennis L. Waters Sr., I knew that he was right. And that's when I began to study incarnational ministry, or the ministry of the presence. I knew that he was right. And a weight lifted from me in regard to that. That's what, as I said to Lachelle, that's what we were to Miss Cuffey. That's what we were to Lachelle as well, and to others. I've had these experiences. I've seen people healed. I've been there. I understood it. When I studied a man named Thomas Throwitt, Thomas Throwitt calls it energy. One calls it spirit. The other one calls it energy. And then there's a correspondence for me when I look at movies. The same thing happens. It's called force. The force is everywhere. Energy is everywhere. In the movie Black Panther, it is called vibration or vibranium. It's the same thing. And so I study. And of recent times, just the other day, I picked up an item from a fellow named called Jung. It's spelled Jung, but it's pronounced Yung, Jung. And there, he is talking about the same thing. He is talking about the psychological types and the psychology of the unconscious. He is talking about the Christ. And I study and I understand because I want to know what's going on within me. And so I had written a study a few years ago. I wrote a study workbook called The Steps of Christ Study Workbook. The same thing is found there as well. Why do I do it? I do it both for myself and for others. The Steps of Christ Study Workbook happened because I had done studies in one of the first churches that I served as minister to, and people, as we were studying, they wanted to have a study guide. And so I wrote out a set of questions, and they did them. And they answered the questions, and that allowed them to feel empowered as they answered the questions, then rather than my giving them answers, which is one thing a person can do. You just give people answers. But when they answered the questions, and then they came in and offered their answers to the questions, so I wasn't giving them my right answers. They had to wrestle with Spirit to get their right answers. And then when they came into the study, they were able to give their right answers from their lives and their wrestling with God to get answers. They found that they were empowered and had their own theology in their own thinking process that they went through between them and Spirit. That's what we do with individuals. It's a very powerful process. So we're not just giving them a theology. They have to develop their own thinking of God. That's what theology is thinking of God. And that's been powerful for us over the course of time. And so the healing that we help people to effect is the healing that comes from within them. They have to want to live. And that's what I think Jesus the Christ did, or the Christ does within us. The Christ is a spirit. The Christ is an energy. The Christ is a power. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I, the Christ in me, lives. And yet it's not I, the ego, I, but it is a Christ in me that lives. That's what we encourage people to do. To have the I, the Christ. Or as Paul said later, we have the mind of Christ. He says in one place, Philippians 2:5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. That's what he says. And so we encourage people to have the mind of Christ. And then Paul said later, we have the mind of Christ. It's a very powerful thing. Very powerful thing. And Carl Jung has that in his book, Psychological Types. It's a type of mind. It's a type of mind. It's a type of mind. It's a powerful, powerful, powerful experience. That's what's embodied in our 8 A's. That's what's embodied there in our 8 A's. It's stage growth. It's developmental growth. You go level by level, by level, by level, by level, by level, by level. It's stage growth. This is something I'm going to stop now. This is something. Blessings to you. Take care.